After the fall of communism in 1989, the new government, freely elected, initiated economic shock therapy, a rapid transition to capitalism. Improvements were dramatic. Between late 89 and June of 1992, real wages rose sevenfold, and by 1997, over 2 million new businesses had been opened. Economic growth averaged 6% a year in the mid to late 1990s. Poland, under communism, had been referred to as an economic basket case, but now it was dubbed Europe's new tiger. Now, we can go on with the European examples in East. It's interesting as Western Europe and North America, which were the birthplaces of individualized capitalism, they've moved towards welfare statism and semi-socialism in the West. And Eastern and Central Europe are moving towards individual rights and capitalism. It's an interesting, sad for us, good for them. Now, another interesting point is this. Even several dictators have been forced by the imminent collapse of their systems into permitting some elements of freedom. Now, I already mentioned Deng Xiaoping in China, introduced various free market reforms into China's oppressive system. The taste of economic freedom helped incite student uprisings in 1989, in which hundreds of thousands demonstrated in favor of increased individual freedoms. Now, the massacre in Tiananmen Square in June of 1989 squashed that specific revolt. But the communists will, in time, discover the contradiction inherent in any attempt to combine elements of economic freedom with a brutal political dictatorship. Mikhail Gorbachev has already discovered the flaw in such a plan. Gorbachev joined the Soviet Communist Party during Stalin's regime and was the protege of Yuri Andropov, head of the KGB, the most repressive secret police apparatus of history. Nevertheless, despite not such a glowing pedigree, Gorbachev initiated various reforms during the 1980s into the Soviet system and economy. Various reforms in support of limited freedom that led to the eventual collapse of communism. Some dictators are gaining a faint glimmer of understanding that freedom is necessary to produce economic abundance. But when a totalitarian state grants its citizens a small taste of freedom, it simply whets their appetite for the whole banquet. In South America, the pattern of statists and dictators forced reluctantly toward capitalism and freedom continued. This is a fascinating story. In Chile, in 1973, General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the communist regime of Salvador Allende in a bloody coup and established a military dictatorship that lasted for 16 years. Pinochet's rule was brutally suppressed. It was akin to military dictatorships the world over. Except for one remarkable fact. Instead of gripping the economy in a tight-fisted command system, Pinochet loosened the reins over the economic life of the individual and moved the country in the direction of a free market. It was an extraordinary sequence of events. He was a bloody-handed dictator, studying the theories of economic freedom with a series of University of Chicago professors that included Nobel laureate Milton Friedman. Astonishingly, Pinochet followed through by applying his lessons in practice. His regime swept aside the disastrous communist policies of Allende's rule, the nationalization of industries, the seizure of farms, the hyperinflation, and introduced elements of capitalism. He privatized the state-owned companies, deregulated the financial sector, ended inflation, and removed trade barriers. After several painful years of readjustment, progress became a reality. In 1980, the World Bank, hardly a bastion of capitalism, the World Bank reported, quote, "Under extraordinarily unfavorable circumstances, the Chilean authorities have engineered an economic turnaround without precedent in the history of Chile," unquote. Pinochet found, however, like Deng and like Gorbachev, that economic freedom has political consequences. As the 1980s advanced, economic freedom led to ever-increasing demands for political freedom. And even fear of Pinochet's dreaded secret police, the DINA, did not deter Chileans from following the logic of a free economy and pressing for a return to full voting rights. In 1989, the dictator yielded, agreeing to open elections in which he was finally voted out of office. Currently, Chile enjoys a vastly freer political system than it had under either Allende or Pinochet, one allied with an economic system of substantial free market elements. As a consequence, its per capita income of roughly $5,000 is significantly higher than such repressed neighbors as Paraguay and Ecuador, and is rising. Capitalism has now been instituted on 3 continents: Europe, North America, Asia, and is beginning to make tortuously slow inroads into a 4th, South America. In South America, we have the inspirational example of Hugo Chavez to show us, what socialism and communism looks like. It's not fun, because he's a brutal dictator, but he's such a buffoon. He reminds me of Mussolini. Not that I was around when Mussolini was in power, but he's the first real buffoonish, clownish dictator, I think, since Mussolini. It gives you a good idea of what socialism looks like in practice. But anyhow, capitalism beginning to make slow inroads into South America. Now, statism, collectivism, the idea that the individual's life belongs to the state. Statism, of course, is the system that denies individual rights and subordinates individuals to the state's power, whether in the form of feudalism, communism, national socialism, fascism, whatever. Statism in some form has been the historic and remains the contemporary status quo. If historic and current political economic systems are viewed as a great laboratory, testing the contrasting effects of freedom and dictatorship, then honest observers now possess an abundance of evidence upon which to base the conclusion. Capitalism, the system of individual rights, has brought increased freedom to human beings all over the world. In Europe, capitalism ended feudalism, the dictatorship of the aristocracy. In America, the principle of individual rights impelled the British colonists to throw off the rule of the monarchy and establish history's freest nation. And the logic of the country's founding principles led, in less than a century, to the abolition of slavery, the 13th Amendment of 1865, a practice that existed everywhere in the world throughout all of history, and that one that is still widespread throughout the non-capitalist world. In Japan, under America's influence, a semi-capitalist, vastly freer society replaced the fascist state that preceded it. In Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, the freedom of their capitalist or semi-capitalist systems enabled those countries or colonies to become havens for millions of refugees fleeing communist oppression. More broadly, it is to the capitalist nations across the globe that immigrants come, millions of them, both historically and currently, often fleeing political and or religious persecution in their homelands. They come on rafts to the United States from Cuba. By the millions, and for close to 20 years, the Vietnamese boat people fled for their lives from communism. And today, more than 1.6 million of them have found freedom, mostly in the West, many in America. Muslims seeking political and religious freedom flee to the Western capitalist nations or semi-capitalist nations from all over the Arab Islamic world. Capitalism, especially America, remains the most beloved. It's funny, America and capitalism is the most hated system generally amongst the intellectuals. There are always exceptions, but generally amongst the intellectuals. But it is by far, by many orders of magnitude, the most beloved system of the oppressed and starving people around the world, judging by people voting with their feet. Where do they want to go? They want to come here. In the past, millions of Irish, Sicilian, and Jewish immigrants fled oppression in Europe. More recently from Asia, and in the last 20 years from Africa. The country always had black immigration from the Caribbean. But in the last 20 or 25 years, we're starting to see an increased black immigration from Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, from all over the world.